After my Grandpa William's funeral, the house felt hollow and still. I stood in the old family home with my wife Emma, my sister Laura, her husband Mark, and our lawyer, Mr. Collins. The house sat near a quiet city in America, filled with memories and dust. We gathered to hear the will when Mark suddenly stood and declared, "All the stocks and the $110 million inheritance go to my wife, the oldest daughter." I laughed, and so did the lawyer, because Mark didn't know the truth about his wife or our family history. That day changed everything for me. The laughter did not last long, but the silence that followed felt endless. Mark's face hardened, his jaw tight, as if he believed volume could still bend reality. The house seemed to listen, every wall holding its breath. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of years lift slightly, because the truth had finally reached the surface. My grandpa always said that silence is honest, and in that moment, silence told everything Mark refused to hear. "What's so funny?" Mark asked again, louder this time. His voice echoed off the high ceiling, sharp and proud. Laura stood beside him, frozen, her eyes moving between me and the lawyer. I could see fear there, not greed. She had always wanted belonging more than money, and that made what came next even harder. Mr. Collins cleared his throat and opened the folder on his lap. The sound of paper shifting was calm, controlled, professional. He had handled fortunes before, and he had handled disappointment too. "Mark," he said, "before we continue, you should understand the legal structure of this inheritance." Mark waved his hand, dismissive, confident. He believed bloodlines were simple and titles were enough. I stood up slowly. "Your wife is not my father's biological daughter," I said. "She was adopted, and not when she was a child. It happened much later." My voice stayed steady, even though my chest felt tight. This wasn't revenge. It was history, plain and written. Laura finally spoke. "Daniel, please." Her voice was quiet, almost breaking. I looked at her and nodded. I wasn't angry with her. I never had been. She didn't ask for the past that shaped her. Mr. Collins continued. The will was written long before the adoption. Mr. William made no changes afterward. Legally, the inheritance follows the wording exactly. Mark's confidence cracked. He sat down heavily, his eyes fixed on the floor. The numbers no longer felt like promises to him. They were walls now. As the lawyer read, memories flooded my mind. Grandpa sitting at the kitchen table, counting figures on paper, explaining stocks to me in simple words. He trusted planning more than luck. He trusted clarity more than emotion. He once told me, "Money should never surprise you. If it does, someone failed to tell the truth." The will was detailed. Every sentence felt deliberate. The stocks, the properties, the savings accounts, all listed carefully. No emotion, just intention. When Mr. Collins mentioned the total value, $110 million, the room felt smaller again. Not because of a number, but because of what it revealed about my grandpa's discipline and foresight. I looked around the house. The wooden stairs, the faded rug, the framed photos. This place had never been about money. It was about patience. It was about time. Mark had only seen the end result, never the work behind it. Laura finally sat down, covering her face with her hands. I walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're still my sister," I said softly. "That hasn't changed." She nodded, tears slipping through her fingers. Mark didn't look up. Pride can be heavier than loss. When the meeting ended, people slowly drifted into other rooms. Emma stepped beside me and squeezed my hand. Her calm always grounded me. We didn't speak about the money. We spoke about going home, about resting, about breathing again. Outside, the city in America moved on as if nothing had happened, cars passing, people laughing, life unaware of our quiet earthquake. Later that evening, I sat alone in the living room. The house felt different now. Not empty, but settled. Like it had finally exhaled. I thought about what came next. Investments, decisions, responsibility. Grandpa didn't leave me freedom to waste. He left me freedom to choose carefully. I also thought about forgiveness. Mark would need time. Maybe years. Maybe never. That was his path, not mine. I promised myself I wouldn't let money turn me into a judge of others. Wealth reveals character, but it also tests it. That night, before leaving the house, I stood at the door and looked back one last time. I didn't feel rich. I felt trusted. Trusted by a man who believed I would remember where everything started. And in that moment, I knew chapter 2 of my life wasn't about inheritance at all. It was about understanding what was truly given and what I was meant to protect. The weeks after the reading of The Will passed slowly, like the house itself was still deciding what it wanted to become. Paperwork replaced silence. Meetings replaced grief. I spent long hours with Mr. Collins, signing documents, reviewing accounts, and learning how carefully my grandpa had planned every dollar. The stocks were spread across industries, balanced and patient, never rushed. It felt like he was still guiding my hand, even from a distance. Emma stayed close through it all. At night, we talked quietly at the kitchen table, mugs of tea growing cold between us. We didn't dream out loud about mansions or fast cars. Instead, we talked about responsibility, about how $110 million could build or destroy, depending on how lightly or tightly we held it. Money, I learned, listens to your intentions. One afternoon, we visited a modest property outside the city in America. It wasn't large, but it had open windows and strong walls. I imagined writing there, thinking there, living without noise. We bought it without hesitation, paying in dollars and keeping the rest untouched. Grandpa's voice echoed in my head. Keep your life simple so your choices stay clear. Laura called me a month later. Her voice sounded calmer, older somehow. She apologized, not for the inheritance, but for the confusion and pain around it. I told her she owed me nothing. Family is not measured by documents, even when documents decide outcomes. Mark didn't come up in the conversation. Some names don't need repeating. As the season shifted, Emma and I traveled briefly to Europe. Not to escape, but to reflect. We stayed in a quiet city with narrow streets and stone buildings, paid for in pounds, blending in instead of standing out. I watched people live ordinary lives, laughing, arguing, loving, all without knowing who I was or what I had. It reminded me that money only matters where people agree it does. During those walks, I thought a lot about my grandpa's past. He grew up with little, worked with care, and trusted time more than trends. He never chased attention. That was his real wealth. I decided then that a portion of the inheritance would be set aside quietly for education and small community projects, no names attached. Giving doesn't need witnesses. Back home, the legal work finally ended. The accounts were officially ours. Seeing the final numbers on paper felt unreal. $55 million in my name. $55 million in Emma's. No applause. No celebration. Just a deep breath. We didn't rush to change anything else. Our days stayed steady. Morning coffee. Evening walks. Ordinary routines anchored us. One evening, I returned alone to my grandpa's old house. It was nearly empty now, waiting to be sold. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, remembering laughter, arguments, quiet lessons. In the study, I found a small notebook tucked behind a shelf. Inside were handwritten notes about investments, but also thoughts about life. One line stood out: leave enough to guide them, not enough to blind them. I sat there for a long time, notebook in my hands, understanding at last what he meant. The inheritance wasn't a reward. It was a test, a mirror. It would show me who I was willing to become. When I locked the door and stepped outside, I didn't feel lost anymore. I felt direction. Chapter 3 wasn't about money settling into accounts. It was about values settling into place. About choosing patience over pride, purpose over display. Grandpa had finished his work. Now it was my turn to begin mine. By the time the year turned, life no longer felt divided into before and after. It felt continuous again, like a river that had been briefly blocked and then allowed to flow. Emma and I settled into our routines with care, not urgency. The money sat quietly where it was meant to sit, working slowly, growing without demanding attention. I learned that wealth does not need daily supervision if it was built with patience in the first place. We decided not to chase a new identity. We kept our circles small. Mornings began the same way they always had, with sunlight through the kitchen window and the sound of the city in America waking up. I returned to writing, something I had put aside for years. Writing helped me remember who I was before numbers ever mattered. It reminded me that stories, not balances, are what people carry forward. Over time, word spread in the family, as it always does. Some relatives reached out with warmth, others with curiosity that felt heavy. I answered kindly, but briefly. I learned that boundaries are a form of respect, both for others and for myself. Grandpa had never explained himself to everyone, and now I understood why. Peace has a way of leaving when too many people feel entitled to explanations. Laura visited one afternoon alone. She looked lighter, like she had set something down. We talked in the garden, the conversation gentle and honest. She told me she was building a life that felt more her own now. I was glad to hear it. Whatever mistakes had been made, I believed people deserved space to grow beyond them. Money had revealed cracks, but it didn't have to define the ending. Emma and I made careful plans. Part of the inheritance was placed into long-term investments, untouched and unannounced. Another part went quietly into projects that mattered to us: libraries, small learning centers, community spaces where people could sit and think. No plaques. No announcements. Just steady support, paid in dollars and pounds, moving quietly through the system like roots under the soil. We spent time in Europe again that summer, returning to the same quiet city. We rented the same small place, walked the same streets, and blended into the rhythm of everyday life. I liked being unknown. It reminded me that importance is often something people assign to themselves, not something the world demands. There, I felt balanced again. One evening, sitting on a narrow balcony, I thought about the moment Mark stood in the old house and declared the inheritance his. I no longer felt anger or amusement about it. I felt clarity. That moment had been necessary. It forced the truth into the open and pushed all of us onto paths we might have avoided otherwise. Some lessons arrive gently. Others arrive loudly. Both are lessons all the same. Back home, we sold my grandpa's house. Not because we wanted to erase it, but because its purpose had been fulfilled. Before handing over the keys, I walked through it one last time. I thanked him out loud, feeling foolish and grateful at the same time. Gratitude, I learned, doesn't need an audience either. As months passed, people sometimes asked how it felt to inherit so much. I never knew how to answer. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like being trusted with something fragile. Money can disappear quickly if you treat it like proof of worth. I chose to treat it like a responsibility that would outlive me if I did my part well. The greatest change wasn't external. It was internal. I became slower to judge, quicker to listen. I learned that security doesn't come from having more, but from needing less. Grandpa had known that all along. His real inheritance wasn't counted in millions. It was in the habits he passed down without ever calling them lessons. Now, when I tell this story, I tell it plainly. I talk about a house, a will, a moment of laughter in a quiet room. I talk about how truth stood firm while pride collapsed under its own weight. And I always end the same way. What I inherited wasn't just $110 million. I inherited clarity. I inherited restraint. I inherited the understanding that the best way to honor what you receive is not to show it, but to live wisely because of it.